City, Pleasant Hill, Colton Elementary, Tillamook, Colton, Oregon, Bend, Pine Creek, Newburgh, Vale. Thank you all so much for being here today. We are excited for this virtual field trip, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual farm field trip. We are live today at the docks in Newport, Oregon. My name is Bella, and I am a student at Oregon State University, and I'll be the moderator today. Before we start our tour today, I wanted to go over a few logistics to make sure we have a great experience. We've muted everyone, and everyone will remain muted throughout the tour so we can all hear our tour guide clearly. If you have any questions, you can send them to us using the chat feature or using the form below the video on our website. Please only type questions in the chat. This will help us see all of the questions and ask as many as possible. It is now my pleasure to introduce our host and tour guide for today's virtual field trip, Angie Dorr with Oregon Sea Grant. Take it away, Angie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We are going to be talking about commercial fishing here in Newport, Oregon, but what I'm going to talk about is true for all of the Oregon coast. So we're going to start off by showing you what it's like to be on a fishing vessel. So we're going to come on inside. I'm going to welcome you on board. This is the fishing vessel Tawny Ann, and we're going to start off in the kitchen and the dining room. So a vessel this size usually has a crew of 3 to 4 people. And when they go out on fishing trips, this is where they're living. They are eating and sleeping and cooking and doing everything on the vessel. And so they need to have, you know, all the things you'd want to have in a temporary home. So as you can see, that's the kitchen and dining room we just walked through, and then you take a few steps and you're in one of the bedrooms, and all the bedrooms are going to look very similar to this one. They're bunks usually. This one's pretty fancy because it has a window or a porthole. We have a small bathroom on a vessel. And then this is the cockpit. This is the bridge of the vessel. This is where all of the controls are. This is how the vessels work to make sure they are talking to one another and to the Coast Guard. They have a lot of radios that allow them to talk to various vessels and to Coast Guard and anyone else they need to talk to. They have a lot of different controls that allow them to turn on and off different lights and to make sure that the cooling system is cool enough to keep the fish fresh. They have different pumps. They have gauges that tell them how fast they're going and how much gas they have. So anything you need to know to run a fishing vessel or ship, you're going to have up here. It used to be that this would all be paper maps, and they would keep maps to figure out where they were and where they needed to be. And now, because of technology, everything is digital. And so we have a lot of digital maps. We have fish finders that tell you where the schools of fish are. And we have digital maps with GPS that tell you, where any obstacles are or navigational challenges, so that a boat doesn't accidentally go over a sandbar that it didn't intend to, or accidentally get into some shallow water when it needs to stay deep. And we're not going to go down there, but just so you can see, down below, there's a very, very steep ladder down, and then that's the engine room. And so anytime you're out on a vessel, you also are doing lots of work on the engine to make sure all the systems are running properly. And then you usually have someone up here, not right now because we're in port, but usually you'd have someone up here sitting in the captain's seat, actually controlling the vessel, making sure, it's on course. They're going the speed and the direction they want. And they have a door right by the chair so they can hop out at any time and go talk to the crew. So we're actually going to go back out and we're going to get off this vessel so that we can talk to you about the types of commercial fishing we have here in Newport. So anytime you're on a fishing vessel, you really have to watch your step. As you can see, there's nets and various gear. but we're going to go ahead and climb over everything and hop off. Okay, and so real quick, I'm going to start with this vessel right here. And we're going to do this one, and then we'll go back to the Tawny and a couple others. So this is one of my favorite fish to talk about. So here in Newport, we catch what are known as hagfish, also known as slime eels. And I don't know if anyone here has ever heard of a slime eel, but they are super cool. They're essentially living fossils. They're very, very, very old, and they've remained unchanged for a very long time. We actually know very little about them because they live in such deep water, and they're so unlike other fish. They're very unusual. We catch them using these big traps, which are baited, and then they have basically look like ice cream cones, and the ice cream cones go in and they narrow, and the fish can swim in to get to that bait, but then they can't swim back out again. And the reason they're called slime eels as well as hagfish is because when they're feeling stressed or they get attacked by a predator, they release massive amounts of slime out through their skin. And so if you ever grab one, it's going to get slime all over your hand. And they can produce lots and lots and lots and lots of slime. In fact, one time there was a traffic accident here in Oregon on the 101 where a truck that was carrying live slime eels had an accident, and the slime eels slid off the truck and onto a car and slimed the entire car and slimed the entire highway, and they had to get the slime off with bulldozers because that slime is so thick and so hard to remove from things. But there are people that eat them, and so we catch them so that people can eat them. And you can actually take their skin, which is very, very strong and leathery, and make it into wallets and belts and other things. So you know, when you get done with this day, you should ask your teacher to show you pictures of slime eels. They're very interesting to look at. So as I mentioned before, we were on the Tawny Ann, and I apologize, I had to put my sunglasses on because we have a beautiful sunny day out here on the coast.
As we're walking, I have a question for you.
Okay, please go for it.
One question, Katie is wondering, how many days does the cruise stay out at sea?
That's an excellent question. We actually were just talking to the boat's owner about that, and she says that during pink shrimp season, they're usually out for no more than 5 or 6 days. It'll depend on what they're catching. So the thing about the Tawny Ann and a lot of the vessels we have here in Oregon is that depending on the type of year, they might be catching different things. So right now the Tawny Ann is set up for pink shrimp. You can tell they're set up for pink shrimp a couple of good giveaways. One are these big wooden doors. When vessels are going out for pink shrimp, they do wooden doors. And that's because wooden doors are pretty lightweight. And when you're catching pink shrimp, you have 2 nets. If you're catching bigger fish, you typically only have 1 net on the vessel. But when they're doing pink shrimp, they have 2. And this is the net right here. Let's see if I can hop up here and point this net out to you. So this right here is the pink shrimp net. Oh, it's all wound up pretty tight, but the mesh size on it is pretty small because the pink shrimp are very small, and they carry a net on each side of the vessel. So they have doors on both sides. The doors are used to actually hold the net open while the net's out in the water. And then inside the net gets pulled behind the vessel with those doors open and a big opening in the front of the net. And as the pink shrimp, which are in the water column, as the pink shrimp are going into the net, sometimes other big fish get picked up in that net too. So say, for example, a halibut or some other big fish might accidentally go into that net too. Well, the fishermen don't want to catch halibut. They want to catch pink shrimp. And so they've come up with cool ways to make sure they're only catching what they're trying to catch. And one of the ways they do it is with these big grates. So you can see this big metal grate. The holes between the grates are really small, so that big fish can't go in there. And the reason you can see the grate so well is because there's a big hole in the net directly above the grate. So that when the net's in the water, the fish go into the opening of the net, they hit that grate, which is going to be like this in the water. They hit it and then they go out the hole that's in the top of the net. Meanwhile, the shrimp are so small, they just keep going right through that grate and then end up in the end of the net where they get caught. So we're going to walk a little bit to the Miss Sue, which is another type of fishing vessel. And if you have any questions while we're walking, you're more than welcome to ask me.
Wonderful.
So,
we do have a few questions.
Okay,
So
go for it.
Another question is, how deep do you drag fishing nets?
So that all depends on what you're trying to catch. So we have several different types of fishing nets here in Oregon. The pink shrimp, as I mentioned, live just right off the surface of the water. And so, and they're in fairly deep water. But we have some fish that are down, more than 500 feet, 1,000 feet, and others that you might catch in 40 or 50 feet. So it really just depends on the type of fish you're catching. Our pink shrimp are in the middle, usually somewhere there, but they exist right off the bottom of the ocean. And really, our fishing vessels try to figure out where the pink shrimp are, and then they go to find them. I'm trying to walk nice and slow for the camera, so apologies if we're making anyone seasick out here on the docks. But it really depends on what you're trying to catch, and where it happens to be. These are all species that move around a lot, and so they're not going to be staying in one place. They're going to be moving pretty consistently. They might be, in 100 feet one year, and then they might be in 150, 200 feet the next. So it all just depends on the species you're looking for and where it happens to be. They typically follow certain types of conditions that they really like. They might like a certain temperature of water. They might like a certain salinity. And so they move around so they can maintain that temperature, that salinity, things like that. So I wanted to show you this vessel. And if you actually, I don't know if you can see it, but there's some seagulls hanging out. One of them just flew off with some western gulls hanging out on top of the net. It's apparently it makes a nice home or a place to rest anyways. But so the Miss Sue right now is set up for groundfish, and we have a lot of groundfish vessels here in Newport. And one of the big differences, as you can see, is with that, first off, this boat's a lot bigger. The doors, which I think you can see at the back, depending on the angle, are made out of metal. And they're metal doors because there's only one net as opposed to two. And the net is much bigger. This boat can also do midwater trawling. And so we have different species that live in midwater versus those that live closer to the ground. And a lot of these vessels can do midwater or groundfish. And they have a big net on the back, and they have a big metal thing. That's called a gantry. That big metal thing that holds that net. That's because if that net is out and it's full of fish, it gets really heavy. And so you need a really strong, sturdy frame to pull that net back on board with the fish. And so these vessels can put big nets out, catch lots of fish, and then they have hydraulic systems and big frames that allow them to pull these nets back on board. And when we say groundfish, we're actually talking about like 90 different species of fish. It includes rockfish. So if you've ever had like fish tacos or something like that, you've probably had rockfish. It includes lingcod. It can even include there's some different sharks that we catch that we actually eat, and skates that we catch that we eat. So there's lots of different species that are included when we talk about groundfish. I'm going to walk you down a little bit more. And again, you can ask any questions you want. We're going to see lots of different types of vessels on the way. This, for example, the Miss Roxanne, the reason it has a second boat on top of the boat is because they are going out catching market squid. Market squid is like if you've ever had calamari, then you've eaten market squid. But market squid exists in big schools, and so they catch it in single big nets that they actually take out with the boat. They put the smaller boat in the water. They put one part of the net to it. They swim that boat out or drive that boat out in a big circle so that net goes in a big circle around the market squid, and then they can pull up all the market squid. Market squid didn't used to live off the coast of Oregon, but as ocean temperatures are getting warmer, we're seeing fish move because, as I said, the fish don't care what state they're living off of. They don't care about borders or boundaries. They want to be comfortable. And so as temperatures change or salinity changes or pH changes, our fish move so they can stay within their comfortable range. And so we're seeing that with market squid. over the last, say, 4 years or so, we've seen more and more market squid off the coast of Oregon. So it's interesting as someone who works in fisheries to see these changes happening, year by year as our fisheries change. The last boat I'm trying to take us to is the Heidi Sue. So the Heidi Sue right now is set up for Dungeness crab. Dungeness crab is really probably the most famous fish or species that we catch here in Oregon. I don't know who on the call has had Dungeness crab before. It's very delicious. It's very tasty. We catch a lot of it here in Newport. We catch it in crab pots. Most Dungeness crab is caught between December and March, so most of it's already been caught for the year. But the Dungeness crab fishery, sorry, am I walking too fast? Dungeness crab fishery, I don't want anyone to fall off the dock, so I have to be careful. Dungeness crab fishery really, goes through until August. And so there are some people that go out during the summer and catch it. So we can have fresh Dungeness crab year round. In fact, rather than take us to the Heidi Sue, I'm going to take us down here because we can look at a crab pot up close and personal. So the funny thing about the docks in Oregon is you never know what you're going to find lying around. People switch gear throughout the seasons. And so a vessel that's been doing Dungeness crab this time of year might take all the crab pots off and they might start doing pink shrimp or some other species because, it makes more sense to catch different species at different times of year. And so anytime we see a commercial crab pot, this is traditionally what they're going to look like. They're going to be round like this. They have buoys attached to them, and that's so that they can all be marked in the ocean. So they have buoys that float on the surface. So they're marked in the ocean so that vessels can go back out and find them. Every single vessel is going to have its own buoy design, and that's legally required. They have to have their own buoy design so that you can immediately identify a crab or the vessel based off the buoy to figure out where different vessels have laid their pots and who a pot belongs to if for some reason something happens and the pot gets washed away or separated. They also usually have little buckets in here, right here, where they would have bait. So if this was actually out in the ocean, and that's because crabs have a really good sense of smell. And so they put bait in these little things. The crabs will all come to this, they'll swim in here to get the bait. And typically how they'll come in is they'll come in through these little traps. And so they'll swim in through these traps. These things will go up, they'll swim in, but then they can't get back out because they only go one direction. And so the crabs will smell the bait, they'll swim inside, and they'll hang out in here, and then they can't get out again. And the fishing vessels will pull these pots up and then open them up. These are going to be tied down. They'll open them up, dump out the crabs, and then throw the pots right back in the water. And so during crabbing season, these pots stay in the water for months and months. They also will have what is called basically kind of like an escape area. So that if anything's too small and shouldn't have been caught, if it's not a legal sized crab, it can come back out because we're only allowed to catch legal sized crabs. And they also are designed so that if a pot does get separated, the thing that's holding the crabs in here, it's made from a rope that will degrade while it's in the ocean. So that if a pot gets separated and lost, the rope will degrade and the crabs can all come out. So we're not accidentally catching crabs in a net, or sorry, in a pot that has been lost. When you do that, it's called ghost fishing and it's bad. You don't want to accidentally catch species in any gear that has been lost. And so we have all sorts of rules to help prevent that from happening.
We have a quick question in the chat.
Yeah, please.
There are a few students
right
wondering
here.
what kind of bait is being used for the different species?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and it can depend. And so sometimes at the beginning of crab season, you actually see fishermen just right out here catching little baits fish. And so a lot of times it's just little tiny species of fish that they catch and they throw in. But I have heard fishermen say they use everything from chicken drumsticks to Spam to whatever, weird leftover meat was on sale. Oftentimes it really has to do with, you want something that smells good, to the crab, smells good to the species. And so it lots of different things. It's not so much a specific type of fish or something like that. It's just some sort of meat product that will put off a strong odor when you get it in the water.
Wonderful. Another question that we have is from Mr. Curtis's class, and their class is wondering, what do you do if you catch unwanted fish?
That's an excellent question. And so we talked about that a little bit when we were talking about the pink shrimp, but that's called bycatch. Anytime you're catching a species that's not the species you're intending to catch, it's called bycatch. With some fisheries, such as the Dungeness crabs fishery or pink shrimp, we have almost no bycatch because the gear is so specialized and so targeted that's only going to catch the species you're trying to get. But we have other species or other types of fisheries, for example, groundfish, where the nets are designed to catch lots of different types of fish, right? And so they make sure the mesh is a certain size. So the mesh on those nets is like this big, so that anything that's too small can swim away because they're not trying to catch the little fish, just the bigger fish. But even so, if you're trying to catch lots of big fish, you might catch the wrong types. And so we have all sorts of different rules and regulations about bycatch. One of them is if you catch too much of the wrong fish, you have to stop fishing. Even if you haven't caught very much of the right fish, you've used up all of your, it's called quota or allowance for the wrong fish, and you just have to stop fishing. And we've passed one of the groundfish vessels. I was going to see if there was another one to look at. But so you have that big net, right, like we saw in the Miss Sue. And if you catch too much, if you have your net in the water and you catch the wrong type of fish, you have to stop fishing for the season. And that's just, it's a bad luck. It's a bad season. It's really hard on the fishermen. So they've come up with all sorts of technology to try and make sure they're only targeting the correct species. They have all sorts of cameras. They really pay attention to where they're fishing and the type of habitat they're fishing in. But also a lot of what we consider bycatch it might be like a species that wasn't intended, but there is still a market for it. So as I mentioned, that there are certain sharks and skates and other fish like that traditionally fewer people eat, but there's still a market for them. And so if they're caught as bycatch, they're still sold. They're just sold oftentimes to smaller markets. And there's actually a group in Oregon that's trying to help encourage people to eat unusual species. So that when we are catching these weird species, they're actually being eaten and not being wasted. Because sometimes if you're catching fish that are really deep down, by the time you pull them up, it's too late to put them back in the water. Meanwhile, we have other species, other fisheries like our salmon and tuna. Albacore tuna is one of my favorites. It's sustainably caught. We catch a lot of it here in Newport. It's caught with a hook and line, like old-fashioned fishing. They go out on a boat, they catch it with a hook and a line. And if they start to pull in a fish and they realize it's not the tuna that they were after, these fishermen are so good at their job, and they use a special hook that doesn't have a barb on it. That's called a J hook. They're so good at their job. They can use a special tool to get that fish off the hook without ever even taking it out of the water. And that fish just swims away. So we have a lot of different things in place to make sure we're not catching the wrong species.
Once the fish are caught, where do they keep the fish on the boat?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And I'm seeing if there's any that I can actually show you. So lots of times they keep them basically in the bottom part of the vessel is going to be a big cooling system, and they keep them in there. The shrimp vessels will keep them in what's called a shrimp hopper that will help them to sort out. And some of them just have kind of refrigerated coolers. So it all depends on the vessels. Like the Timmy Boy, which is right behind us, is a really big vessel, and they catch crab. And so they have a large area where they can keep crab. Crab you have to keep live, or it's recommended you keep live. And so what they have, all of these vessels that do crab, basically have a holding tank on the vessel that allows them to bring in fresh salt water from the ocean and recirculate it through the whole time they're bringing in the crab. And so that's kind of in where you might consider the basement of the fishing vessel. You can't see it. It's below the decks, below where everyone's standing. Other vessels, you catch species that you want to freeze immediately. So albacore tuna, for example, in order for albacore tuna to be really, really tasty and fresh, you want to freeze it immediately. And so they have containers on board where they have ultra cold water. So basically, they have water that's has some brine in it, some salt in it, which allows it to get even colder than freezing fresh water, that they can use to immediately cool albacore tuna down to instantaneously, almost very, very cold temperatures, and then they put it on ice. And sometimes a walk-in freezer, depending on the size of the vessel, and sometimes just a really big ice chest or cooler. So it depends on if you want the species to be alive, if you need it immediately on ice, if you need it immediately frozen. It depends on what you're trying to do. And all these vessels have different ways of achieving that to make sure that when the fish gets back to port, it's as fresh as possible.
Awesome. Allison is wondering who checks the boats to make sure that they are following the rules of fishing.
Yeah, that's the Coast Guard. And we actually have a Coast Guard station right here in Newport. It's right outside of range right now, but we can maybe at the end of or something, but we have a Coast Guard station here in Newport, and if that's the job of the Coast Guard, they board vessels while they're out at sea. And then here in port, we have Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they will do visits as well, to make sure that species or vessels are only catching the type of species they are. And they also make sure everyone has permits for the type of gear. For example, if you don't have a permit to go out and catch crab, you can't have crab pots on your vessel. And so they're also coming out and they're checking vessels and making sure that the type of gear that's on each vessel matches up with the permits that vessel has.
Awesome. Mrs. Shadden's class is wondering, does the net size being used determine the size of the boat?
That's a great question. And the answer is not necessarily. In order to have a really, really, really big net, you need a big boat. But you can have a big boat with smaller net sizes. The net sizes typically are more or less consistent. Pink shrimp, the net sizes are all more or less the same. They might be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller depending on the boat size, because the boat has to be strong enough to pull that net in. But that doesn't necessarily mean you won't see a big boat with smaller nets, because that's just the kind of the traditional net sizes. And once you reach a certain point, it doesn't make sense to have a larger net anyways. But like we saw at the very beginning, that very large metal frame, that gantry for that net, that boat can have a really, really big net because it can pull in a lot of fish at once. It's a big boat. It means it has a lot of holding space to hold the fish once they've been caught. Whereas a smaller boat would never have a net that large. It's going to have a much smaller net because it doesn't have a big enough system to pull that net in, or as much space to store the fish that's caught. And you never want to catch more fish than you can keep fresh on board.
Okay, another question we have is, how many different kinds of fish are caught each year in Oregon?
I can give you kind of the Miss Roxanne is actually emptying. I mentioned lots of them have those bilge tanks where they keep fish fresh. The Miss Roxanne is actually emptying theirs. That's a common occurrence around here, and sometimes you have to watch out because it'll happen right onto the walkway. But so the major species that are caught here in Oregon are Dungeness crab, the Oregon pink shrimp, Pacific whiting, which is also known as hake. We catch hagfish, we catch market squid, and then our ground, we catch albacore tuna, we catch coho salmon, and then up and down the coast, we also catch Chinook salmon, we catch lingcod, we catch halibut, we catch sturgeon in some places, and then our groundfish fishery catches lots of different species. It's all managed together, but it's like 90 plus different species. And that includes all of our rockfish species, of which there's like 40 something different rockfish species that we catch. And then it also catches sablefish, which is sometimes called black cod, as well as, like I said, our skates and our sharks and our rays. We also catch a lot of different types of shellfish. And so we have razor clams and different types of clams that people catch commercially and recreationally. And then we also have aquaculture here in Oregon, where we do different types of oyster and different types of seaweeds. And so there's a lot of different things that are being caught or grown or harvested along the coast of Oregon.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I just want to take a moment to thank Angie for sharing all of this great information with all of us. I learned so much today, and I hope you all did too. Thank you to our participants for joining us for this virtual field trip. We hope you all have a great rest of your